The Livella Part 4 Power Games. The story so far. A dryad has deposited a newborn baby boy into the hands of his human brothers, because dryads only keep their female born. Hidden at a distance, a sinister old man who calls himself Ruzevir the Underlord witnesses this exchange. Using blood magic, he establishes a telepathic link with his daughter, Mali, a high-ranking priestess in Itland's capital. Together they discuss the potency of the baby's fairy blood and begin to scheme about how to abduct the infant. Because of the natural strength and martial prowess of the baby's guardians, who are half human and half fairy folk, this is no easy task. To this end, Mali, who is in fact a hierophant, enters the Moraz, a mysterious labyrinth from a forgotten age, known to hold forbidden knowledge, situated deep underneath the ecclesiastical citadel of the Itlan. Inside the Moraz, a place in which time is completely static, Mali encounters Omnia, a priestess who has been wandering lost in the labyrinth for over 2 centuries, after finding out that her rootman lover had been mistakenly killed by dryads while carrying some corrupted resonance crystals through their forest. We now continue the story. Ruzevir the Underlord made his way back to the Depository under cover of darkness. He had, for several days, been eking out a miserable and degrading existence, as he often did, as a flagrant on the outskirts of the nearby village of Enklang, submitting himself stoically to the charity of its wholesome community and all the nauseating words of encouragement and unsolicited compassion that came with it. Like everything Ruzevir did, this was done very deliberately and consciously. Though the Underlord had no real need, nor a special appreciation for such things as kindness and generosity, he subjected himself to these because it gave him the spiritual fuel he needed to advance his purpose in this life. He saw himself as a living embodiment of the wheel, whose only purpose was to turn and keep its load moving, with no personal regard for the direction of travel or the significance of the destination. And so, after his hierophant daughter had imparted her ideas to him in another remote communication, Ruzevir had suppressed his unbidden, paternal surge of pride for his daughter's latest demonstration of genius, and had scuttled furtively back to the small wooden cottage where he had witnessed the recent forestiprosity in order to set the first events of her design in motion. Ruzevir reached the Depository in the darkest hour before dawn, finding his way slowly and cautiously in the shrubby and thorny blackness with a luminescent crystal that was bright enough to cast its light perhaps 2 steps in front of him, and no more. He deliberately avoided the more brightly lit community thoroughfare with its thin spread of respectable patrons travelling at such an hour, even though that road would have made his journey considerably easier and more comfortable. Ruzevir's comfort was irrelevant to him. What mattered right now was acquiring that baby with its potent infant fairy blood, and Ruzevir would risk no witness to his actions in making that happen. The night sky was mostly overcast as Ruzevir crept out of the long grass bordering the open clearing in which the Depository was situated, only the planet known to the Itlan as Tiamat being bright enough to shine dimly through the gathering clouds. With a stealth that belied his wizened and skeletal appearance, the Underlord crept towards the tall, thin copper rod protruding from the ground just outside the Depository's adjacent barn, and the crystals of varying sizes and hues arrayed in an intricate geometric pattern in a circle of roughly 3 feet around the rod's base. The array was dimly lit by a weak light crystal set into the crossbeam above the barn's entrance. With a wide, toothy grin and a crafty expression, Ruzevir plucked out one of the larger crystals from the array and tossed it several yards away in the direction of the forest's edge. Then he skulked away back into the shadows. Seconds later, the barn's feeble light crystal faded out. Naro awoke suddenly from yet another of his dreams featuring Livella. This time he had been wandering lost along never-ending corridors filled with shining words and symbols he could only see out of the corner of his eye, but when he looked at the words and symbols directly, they had disappeared. An ethereal, sing-song voice from somewhere up ahead had been calling his name.
Naro, Naro.
And when he finally reached the source of that soft call, a tiny, glowing Livella with a blindfold across her eyes, she had thrown a hard object like a stone at him. This had jolted him back into wakefulness. Naro had dreamed about Livella numerous times in the past year or two, and every time he had found himself in such a dream, fully lucid about who he was, he had always been able to ask the Livella at least one question, although he had seldom been able to remember the response, or even the question itself for that matter. But this time was different. This time he had been yanked back into the waking world before he had even had a chance to speak to the Livella. This time, the Livella had thrown an object at him, and none too gently either. He sat up in his bed and fumbled for his bedside crystal, as it was still not yet light outside. Grasping the fist-sized crystal, he slotted it neatly into its little copper holder set into the surface of his bedside table, but to his surprise, it failed to start. It failed to start glowing. The small room he had been allowed to claim as his own a year or so ago, as was the custom for forest brothers who had reached adolescence, remained dark. Some inner urge made him go over to the window and look outside. Naro's room overlooked the depository's barn, and Naro noticed immediately that the ever-present little light above the barn's entrance had gone out. Frowning a little at this unusual occurrence, such a thing would normally only happen after a bad storm or a particularly heavy gale, Naro pulled on a night robe and crept out of his room to go and investigate. Of course, because the usual outside light had gone out, Naro could see very little. Only the minimal, twinkling radiance of Tiamat cast any kind of light at all in the partially clouded pre-dawn sky. Naro went over to the barn to investigate what had happened to the normally constantly shining crystal above the barn door. He could just about make out by the limited starlight available that the crystal was still in its place. It had just gone out. One of their 2 cows in the barn, hearing Naro's footsteps, mooed enthusiastically, thinking it was time for milking already. Naro turned around to examine the array behind him. The only conceivable reason why the barn door light and his bedroom light crystal would not work must be that the array itself had been disturbed. Sure enough, after getting down on his hands and knees and tracing his fingers around the geometric patterns of crystals at the base of the array, he soon identified that one of the larger crystals was missing from its holder. Naro quickly looked around himself in the gloom, but the light was far too poor for him to be able to stand a chance of locating it. With a sigh, Naro returned to the depository, but he didn't bother going back to sleep. The first pre-dawn light had just started to render the eastern skies a slate-grey colour. He knew that Weld would be up before too long, and that he would also notice straight away that the depository had a power outage. Resolving to be ready to tell Weld what he had discovered at the array, Naro seated himself quietly in the dining area with his eyes closed, trying to remember more details of the latest Livella dream he had had. It now seemed clear to Naro that by throwing a hard object at him, the Livella in his dream had been trying to warn him about the situation with the missing crystal from the array.
Naro?
Weld said in surprise when he came down the stairs just as the sun was beginning to rise a little while later, cradling the baby in one powerful arm as he held the sapnopper to the baby's mouth with his free hand.
You're up early.
He squinted at the eldest boy.
Why aren't you dressed for combat school?
Naro shrugged. I don't think I'll be going to combat school anymore, Master Weld. I'll explain in a moment. Have you noticed the power is down?
It is?
Weld frowned.
I thought it was just my old bedroom crystal finally conking out.
Still holding the baby, he went over to the kitchen area and tried to activate the depository's small carry pod. But it didn't respond.
Hmm,
said Weld.
Naro, have you been out to check the array?
Yes, Master Weld. I noticed that one of the secondary crystals was missing from its position, but it was too dark for me to see where it had gone. Weld placed the baby gently in his little dining room cradle, set aside the sapnopper, and headed for the front door, beckoning Naro to come with him.
Let's go and see if we can find it then.
As they walked the short distance from the front door of the depository to the array, Weld clapped Naro heavily but playfully on the back, causing him to stumble slightly.
So, my boy, what's this you say about not going to combat school anymore? You still have plenty to learn, lad.
I know, Master Weld, Naro agreed, but something last night finally convinced me I'm no root man. Weld stopped and looked critically at the boy, sizing him up. Although not a small boy by any means, he was clearly undersized for a root boy of his age, and still a clear foot shorter than Weld himself.
Well, you are a bit on the dainty side for a forest brother, I'm not going to lie.
Weld admitted.
But not by all that much. I mean, it's not unheard of. And you're still young enough to have not quite started your main growth spurt yet. There's still time.
I know that, Master Weld, but it's just that I had another one of those Livella dreams last night. That's like the third one this week, and this time the Livella threw a rock at me, which caused me to wake up. And when I realized my own bedroom crystal wasn't working, I looked out of the window and noticed the barn light was off too. So I came out here and felt around in the dark, and sure enough, one of the secondary array crystals wasn't in its holder. The boy shook his head. Come on, it's obvious, Master Weld. I'm going to be a seer, not a root man. Ever since I became, he flushed slightly, hormonal, I've been dreaming about fairy folk and I haven't grown as much as I should. Then the dream last night with the Livella throwing the rock at me, waking me up, and that business with this crystal. I think it's enough indication, don't you? Weld regarded the boy, who had been like a son to him silently, his half-fairy eyes a vivid, translucent amber in the brightening morning light. Finally, he let out a deep, melancholic sigh from his broad chest.
I suppose it's inevitable, lad. I've been hoping against hope it wasn't so. Not because of any kind of disappointment about you becoming a seer, you understand. No, it's a very fine thing to be a seer. I myself was partly raised by dear old Comfit, a seer who lived at my old depository. No, it's just that it means we'll have to say goodbye to you a lot sooner. You'll be needing to go to the seerage at Hoselex before the year is out.
At that, Weld turned and trudged sadly the rest of the way over to the depository's array. Watching the only father he had ever known for a moment as Weld began inspecting the array, Naro was struck by a profound, almost visceral sense of loss that surprised him with its intensity. This was confusing. Naro was a little sad at the prospect of leaving home soon, certainly, but he had been contemplating it for a year now, ever since he realized he was probably not going to become a root man. But he was also extremely thrilled and excited at the prospect of moving on to the next phase of his life, and meeting other forest brothers who were like him at last. Seers were quite rare. Only roughly 1 in 20 forest brothers developed into one during their adolescent years, and so this sudden sharp sense of loss seemed a little excessive and out of place somehow. Naro was snapped out of his lingering sense of foreboding by Weld calling him over to the array.
This is quite strange,
Weld remarked as he crouched down, squinting at the empty orichalcum holder of the second concentric ring surrounding the man-high copper rod that stuck up from the center of the array.
Normally, a freak gale would display several of these, not just one.
He stood up and cast about him in the brightening dawn light.
And they would be scattered around close to the array, but there really is only one missing, isn't there? And it's nowhere to be seen.
Remembering again the Livella dream that had awoken him, Naro suggested, maybe some forest creature came out here and messed with it? Weld scratched his head, a critical expression on his unshaved face.
Unlikely. Wildlife tends to avoid power arrays. They're much more sensitive to the telluric disturbances. Fey folk even more so. I mean, it's not impossible, I guess.
Still thinking about the rock the Livella had thrown at him in the dream, and deciding now might as well be the time he started to take his seer identity more seriously, Naro moved a little further from the array, closer to the forest edge, and scanned the hard-baked, well-trodden clay that gradually gave way to clumps of grass before the trees. Only a moment later, he spotted the egg-sized indigo crystal lying in the dirt maybe 10 or 15 paces away from the array. "Here it is," he called to Weld, picking it up and waving it above his head. Weld came over to him and took the resonant crystal out of his hand.
That is weird,
He murmured.
How did it get there? I guess it must have been an animal of some sort. But why take it away and carry it this far only to drop it? It doesn't make any sense.
"I reckon it wasn't an ordinary animal," Naro disagreed. "I reckon it was one of the Fae." He reminded Weld about his dream. Weld listened to him gravely. Then he laid a huge hand on the boy's shoulder.
I guess that settles it, lad,
He said a little sadly.
As soon as the priestess arrives to name the baby, we're sending you off to Hozelex.
Naro, his heart a swirl of conflicting emotions, could only nod silently in agreement. Then he looked up. "The priestess is coming, you say? When?"
A message was delivered last night at the guild,
said Weld.
Odd thing, they're sending a priestess of the void, which is highly unusual for a naming ceremony. I don't think I've ever heard of one of their lot doing such a duty. It should be very interesting. I've never met one of her kind before.
End of part 4. Will the boys at the Depository find out more about who is messing with their array? What will they make of this mysterious priestess who is coming to name the baby? And what is Ruzevir the Underlord up to? Stay tuned to find out. Hi to all my listeners. A big thank you for tuning into this latest instalment of the Livella. Don't forget, if you do feel inclined to tip me for my work, you can do so via the link in the description. Cheers.